Hello everybody, I'm Kathy Creger and I welcome you to the Scotch Bonnet pepper painting class at the Minnesota School of Botanical Art. In this class we'll explore how to add texture, shiny surfaces, and blending colors. I like to start out with a really good contour drawing that has all the details I need. And then without spending much time, as quickly as possible, I try and do a tonal drawing with the side of a pencil or a Q-tip, my fingers. I tend to use larger brushes, size 3, 4, or 5, Winsor Newton or Raphael. And I like to do a transfer that shows what I need, but sometimes add a little extra pencil to get the details. Also, when I start a painting, I use the palest colors possible, barely seeable. And then as I'm working on the painting, I build layers and layers. Each one gets a little more pigment. Start to add in some of the shadows to show some form and where I'm going. And I just keep layering. More color, a little more texture with the brush strokes, a little more form in the shadows. Here you can see how I've deepened the color, started to make some of the texture, the hills and valleys, a little more obvious. And you just start to see nice little peppers. When it comes time to transfer, you can either go from the contour drawing or from your little tonal drawing. I use handmade transfer paper, it smudges less. And you place it underneath so that you're not smudging your hand as you start to do the tracing. Move slowly around the edges. If there's any little bumps or wiggles in the piece that you're tracing, make sure to put them in there so that it shows up well on the transfer. Sometimes I move my hand away from the subject and sometimes towards me depending on the curve. And every so often I'll check to make sure that the transfer is going through well. Once I've got the transfer complete, I lift everything out and make sure that what I need is there. Quite frequently it's a little too dark for me to start, so I take a little piece of kneaded eraser and dab away some of the extra graphite until it's just dark enough for me to see. And then here I'm looking at the actual photo and I'm really paying attention to some of the texture areas, the highlights especially, places that I need to leave alone a little bit. And that's where I usually will put in a little bit of cerulean, very pale, but enough for me to see. And I'm using the regular colors from the school. And here you can see I'm just starting to put in a little bit of the highlights. You can actually see more that it's wet than the color, but it keeps me from losing them later on in the painting. And it's very wet here, it's a very pale wash. And I just move around and look at the photo and back at where I'm in the painting to find the spots that need a little of the color. If you imagine the light coming from the upper left, and you know the highlights are going to be on the top of the stem and the top of the bumps of the peppers. So I'm adding some cerulean into those spots. Sometimes I go over things a little bit before they're dry. And then here I've started to add several layers of the cool yellow. Again, very pale to begin with, you can barely see it. But what you do see now are probably 5 or 6 layers. Also at this point, I start to put some of the shadows in with more of a pale purpley color. And again, it's a very light wash, but I'm starting to kind of give myself a roadmap on where the darker areas in the painting will be later on, what's underneath, what's behind. And I do that usually with the opposite color of what I'm using. So here I've got a lot of yellows. I'm using a purple that I mixed with, the colors that we have, nothing special. And I like to put some pigment down with one brush see how it goes, and then sometimes I'll go in with a second brush that's barely even moist and feather things out a little bit, just to kind of give a smooth transition. And little bits of color dry pretty quick, so sometimes you can go back in and just put another little layer on top of what you did not that much longer ago. And I use a not very good brush to feather. It is damaging to the brush more than the paper. I think the snodgrassing when you do this, a little dark area in the corner that pushes things behind. Start to add some more color, still keeping in mind the highlights, and more color into the shadows. And there's almost creases in these peppers. There's hills and valleys, so I like to get some of those valleys in with that purpley color. Sometimes I'll do it with ultramarine blue. It just kind of depends on what I'm looking at in the subject. So even though these are mostly yellowy, orange, and green peppers, you use just about every color in your palette to get the effects you need. So I'm just picking around. Started to add a little more shadow in a couple places. And that's the same thing as building up the other washes. You do everything everywhere a little bit at a time so that you don't have one thing that's overworked and one section that's underworked. Just keep moving. And here you can see I've added several more layers of color. I'm going in with the May Green, which seems pretty garish, but it really was kind of the bright color of the peppers. And I'll pretty moist brush here. Again, kind of lace them on and then feather it around. And the yellows, more layers, a little less moist here, not dry brush, but not washes either, kind of a medium brush. And I'm picking around the edges of the highlights as I add the texture and color. It's little short brush strokes, more in this pigment density. And you just, again, keep kind of looking at where things are in your photo and your subject. It kind of informs you on where to add a little bit more, playing each side of that little bump off each other with the highlight in the middle. And I'm also trying to keep track of the texture, the little hills and valleys that are inherent to this pepper, but still keeping the highlights, the shiny spots. And it's usually little short strokes. Sometimes I might do longer ones and try and paint in the direction of growth, but you also have to paint in the direction of the hills and valleys sometimes. So it's a constant looking at your subject and then coming back and looking at your painting. I'm always adjusting the edges, feathering a little. And I'm keeping track of the form because they're in that one central bump. It's like a ski jump. It's high on the top, then it sinks in the middle, and then it flares back out like a lady's skirt. And so I'm working those things in as I move along. And always going back in and checking to make sure that the shadowy areas don't get neglected. And little short strokes, layer after layer, and following the contours of the hills and valleys in each section, because they're each a little different. I try to remember to move right from left to right, just so I'm not putting my hand on the wet paint. I've been known to do that more often than not. And you just keep adding those little details. Check your subject again, see where you are. And each pepper is slightly different, even though they're the same colors. You may have added a little bit more orange because the back side of this is orange. Again, I'm following would kind of valleys first, or the deeper, shadowyer areas. Work around the highlights. Little short strokes, adding color. And I usually will try and feather around the highlights, even though I tried to leave them out. Kind of soften the edges a little bit. And you just kind of watch for what's going on from your subject. The sections or the segments of the pepper curve in different ways. Some are bumpier than others. Some have more puckery kind of shapes to them. So I try and keep that texture not the same all the time, but really randomize it for each section of the pepper. Really look at what's showing up on the photograph of the subject or the subject itself. It is easy to kind of get in a rhythm or a habit, and you start assuming that oh, I'm just painting away, and then all of a sudden you look and go, oh, that wasn't in the subject. So you keep checking. I'm going to try and define the edges as I'm working along. And I try and keep my edges clean most of the time. But on surfaces like this, it's a little more important to be careful with the placement of the pigment. Looking in the highlights especially, it's a little easier to get away with stuff in the shadows. As you can see, I've got several more layers on. I started to work into the greens a little bit deeper. Got more of a warm, kind of golden orange color. I did use the warm yellow quite a bit for this, with maybe a touch of the alizarin. And I'm still working on the form, and defining the hills and valleys. Each time I add a color, it kind of works into certain areas differently. I'm still trying to keep the top left a little lighter on both, because that's where the overall highlights are besides the shiny spots. That's where the light struck area is. And I'm still adding layers to the shadow areas in places that are underneath or further back. These are called Scotch Bonnet peppers because they look like a little tam o' shanter upside down. And there is actually a little extra material in the bottom of the pepper that gives you that depth. And when I try and work all the way around on things, I kind of did a lot on the stems at first, worked more into the peppers, but you can see things are starting to come up a little more evenly across the painting. But I do want to go in and start adding a little bit more texture and definition to the stems to keep them up. And this is, again, layering colors. I have more ultramarine. I probably mixed some with that May green. And I may have used a teeny bit of something else to darken it a little. I use Carolyn green sometimes. That might have entered into this, but you really don't need it. And I'm picking out the stems they're not round, they're not smooth, they're segmented. And they're not very flat segments, but you can see that there's hills and valleys in the stems where they attach to the fruit too. Sepals were. So little by little, I'm kind of moving things around. Sometimes it's easier to bring things upside down to paint a curve than to try and move your hand away from you. And so in certain stages, I will move the painting around to make it easier to get the strokes that I need. And as I said, I kind of keep working, building colors. There's very pale May green underneath, but the color of the pepper itself is quite a rich, bright green. So I'm using almost a stippling kind of stroke with my brush. Not dry brush, but very little water, just enough to kind of get some color on. And I'm going back over those areas where I see the deepest colors, as you can see on the right hand one, but I'm also kind of feathering things in at that transition zone between the orange and the green, because the green does kind of fade. It's not a straight line, it's not a sharp edge to the color. They kind of softly move into each other. That's what I'm trying to work with here. And on this pepper, there's quite a bit of green on the right-hand side on that edge, so I'm going in with a little bit more, but I'm also looking at the fact that that bump is separated from the other section of the pepper. So there's a little crease there that I'm kind of working to bring in a little shadow, a little bit more form, depth. And also the central area on the right-hand side had a little valley with a couple of little ridges in it. So I'm kind of bringing a little shadow color, a little of the green into those areas very faintly. Again, I'm almost using a wash there just to kind of to blend those colors together without getting them muddy. And just keep working. And a little bit more of the deeper green, probably some more ultramarine in there, but again, stippling, kind of filling in the spaces in between, or leaving space in between for the other colors to come through. It kind of helps make that gradation more readable, more realistic. And then sometimes I'll go in again with a barely moist brush and just kind of feather things around, soften things. It can be kind of tedious little detail work. While I've got the greens going, I tend to use, when I've got colors going, I tend to go around the painting and use those colors instead of remixing or re-warming or wiping or wetting. And so I'll do a little more work on the stems, a bit more blue in the tones, and starting to define the almost the ribbing in the stems where it attaches to the fruit. Working on the shadowier areas, cleaning up my edges, always cleaning up edges. Looking at the subject, looking at the little places where the stem meets the pepper. There's always like a dark little hollow underneath. Kind of defining things a little bit more while I have the color on my brush. I'm taking some time here to kind of look at how far I've gotten and where I need to go. These next areas, you can see, are quite a bit darker. We've done several layers, really starting to define the hills and the valleys. The texture is starting to show through, but you still have that little bit of glow from the highlights. The color kind of meshes well together in the areas that it needs to. And now it's almost like dry brush. It's not quite dry. I'm doing some strokes to kind of blend things a little, but I'm also really paying attention to the darker areas, the shadowier areas, the places that things start to round under. So I'm putting a lot deeper color in, but I'm putting it in a way that helps define the form and the texture. So again, it's, keep checking your picture, your subject, keep looking at what you're working on instead of what just happens automatically when you start to daydream or your mind wanders and you're just stippling and painting away, and then all of a sudden it's like, oops. So be definite, really pay attention. Place each stroke in the place that you want it to be, not where it just ends up. And then here I'm defining the edge, adding a little color, playing with that shape of that segment. adding a little bit more red, maybe a little bit more purple. Those little rumply bumps in the surface of the pepper are tiny little strokes that you add in, keeping the highlights highlighted and the shadowy areas or the valleys where they need to be. So it's starting to look more like little peppers. I'm just moving from one segment to the next, feathering things around, stippling a little. So this is the almost finished piece. You can see how many layers have been built up to make it this far. And the class on Monday, November 2nd, will kind of go through the whole process again, but get into some of the more finishing details to really make your little Scotch Bonnet peppers pop. Thanks for taking the time today, everybody.